Joining us, Meron Rappaport, editor at the Local Call, writer at 972 Magazine. Meron, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. How are you?
We spoke to you last almost 30 days ago. I guess it was March 1st. And at that point, there had been already a remarkable amount of protests happening in Israel over essentially a plan by the Netanyahu government to really disempower the judiciary in Israel. It would have allowed the 61 members of the Knesset, a simple majority in a government that only forms if you have a majority in this instance, to overrule anything the court said. Give us a sense, just before we get into what has happened over the past 30 days. I know this is going backwards a little bit, but for folks who have not been following this, give us a sense of just like what was behind the desire to do this. One of them, I think some people attribute it to, is that Bibi Netanyahu is facing criminal charges, and it would be nice to be able to say, the court, we don't need to listen to that.
Yes, of course, the personal issues of Netanyahu are important. We don't know how much, of course, but I think it certainly played a role. But I would say that the resentment against the court, and especially the Supreme Court, is something quite, goes back at least 30 years. Especially on the ultra-Orthodox and the Haredim Jews in Israel, that feel that the court has imposed on them all kind of issues that regard equality, and also the settlers. The settlers are a group that feels that the Supreme Court has given a support to Palestinians sometimes regarding settlements. It's very limited, to say the truth, but the settlers felt that they don't have a free hand with the Supreme Court. And maybe there's another general, resentment against the court. That is something, I think is not unfamiliar also among the Trumpist right in the US. So, there is this resentment against the court, against the law. So it's not only Bibi's Netanyahu private issues, it's something deeper.
And I think we get that, that has become, I think, sort of like broken out in the open a little bit over the past 24 hours at the very least. But we'll catch up to that. Would those parties that we're talking about here, particularly the religious fundamentalists and the settler nationalists, do they describe themselves as anti-democratic? I mean, Israel does not have a constitution, which is also going to play big into our conversation. But and in this country, those forces, I think, are at least by act anti-democratic. But they don't articulate it, in part because it's so closely associated with a sort of a patriotism. It's nice to sort of like dress yourself up that way. Do they feel that same impulse or need to market themselves as democratic, or are they openly undemocratic?
No, I think they describe themselves. The Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, is something else, because their parties, is of course, in themselves are non-democratic. There's no internal election, and they're appointed by a group of rabbis that appoint the Knesset members, the least, to the Knesset, to the parliament. So, but on the contrary, Simcha Rotman, who is the head of the Judiciary committee in the Israeli parliament, is part of what's called the religious Zionist party, headed by Bezalel Smotrich. He claims, and also Yariv Levin, the justice minister, from the Likud party, they claim that they represent the true democracy, the direct democracy style Athens, the really direct democracy. Who has the majority can decide, and no one should be allowed to interfere in the decision of this majority. So they claim that they are a real expression of direct and true democracy.
I mean, there's some argument that that's intellectually defensible because there is no constitution. They don't necessarily have. There is not necessarily a history, and certainly in practice, of a problem with the tyranny of the majority, like we have in at least in American sort of philosophical, if you will, thought, I guess.
Well, I would also just put the caveat that it's only intellectually defensible if you, in the confines of this conversation, exclude Palestinians entirely from the democracy.
Well, that also, yes.
Yes.
Of course. We first of all, there's no, as there is no constitution, there is no safeguard for any minority. Of course, the Palestinian inside Israel. I'm talking about first about the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the 20% minority of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and of course, and women, not a minority, and other groups do not enjoy any, because there is no constitution. There's no safeguards that the Knesset, the parliament, will decide any laws that will infringe on their rights. And added to that, of course, as was rightly said here, is the fact that Israel controls 4 million Palestinians without any rights in the occupied territories, especially in the West Bank, but also to a certain extent the people of Gaza. So they are not part of this democratic game at all, and they are not defended at all. So in this case, yes, this seemingly majority is really a farce, because Jews are a minority between the river and the sea today. The Palestinians are the majority, a small majority, if you consider the Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza. They are a majority. So it's really a minority that acts as if it is a majority and wants to have also a tyranny of the majority. So therefore, it's really, really absurd.
Well, my question for you, though, is what are secular Israelis most worried about then with this judicial overhaul? Because from the outside, I think it's easy for us to say, look, it's fascism turning inward in Israel, which was always going to happen given the extent of the apartheid. But what are the direct threats that secular, more moderate Israelis feel from this being kind of spearheaded by the far-right Netanyahu coalition?
Well, the Supreme Court, to a certain extent, did assured certain rights for secular Jews, secular citizens in Israel, from rights for LGBT rights, for rights for many other issues. That the Supreme Court did interfere, and also to a certain extent, very little, but still to a certain extent, for the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel. For example, there was some sort of a ban on Palestinian buying lands in parts of Israel, inside Israel. I'm not talking about the West Bank. And the Supreme Court disallowed this ban. So the Supreme Court did do many things, but you have to understand that the atmosphere that the new government created from even before this reform was launched, the atmosphere was really aimed at people felt that they are really threatened because there were low propositions not yet adopted, like women who would go to the Western Wall in unmodest way should be jailed. That was a proposition by one of the ultra-Orthodox parties. There was also signed in the coalition agreement that a completely homophobic member of Knesset will be in charge of all the educational program in the Ministry of Education. So there was this attack from the very beginning, not all of it directly connected to the reform itself, but the atmosphere was that secular Jews, seculars in Israel in general, are under threat. Now, again, there is, I know there are many who will say, yes, Zionism was not democratic from the beginning. That's correct, because it disregarded the rights of the native Palestinian. But you have to remember at the same time that from 1920, from the beginning, right after the beginning of the British Mandate, there was the first elections for a sort of parliament for the Jews in Eretz Israel, in Palestine. So the tradition, the democratic tradition of this maybe elite, but that from the beginning of Zionism, there is a strong democratic tradition of 100 years. So just, wiping out this tradition was something that people felt, wow, what's going on?
All right. Well, let's just do a little bit of a TikTok over the past 48 hours, if you will, so that people get a sense of just how, and when we spoke almost 4 weeks ago, we were seeing 100,000, sometimes close to 200,000 protesters a weekend, and for a country like Israel, that's, the equivalent of 3 or 4 million people a weekend going out in the United States and having these protests. Over the weekend, this past weekend, the numbers I was reading were close to 500,000, which would be 18 million people protesting in this country. And it's extraordinary numbers. And then what started to happen, it appears, was members of the military were basically saying, and I don't know if folks know this, but there's everyone in Israel at age 18 goes into the military automatically. And so this is a big deal. Walk us through some of that and get a sense, so that we can get a sense of just exactly, when the threshold was met that Netanyahu had to say, we're going to take a pause on this for a month.
Yes, it's really extraordinary. It's the most extraordinary, I think, civil protest that Israel has known since 48. Nothing similar. We're talking, yes, in the last weekend, some people say it was even 650,000 went to the streets. It was completely decentralized. There was no really, it was all kind of groups, high-tech people, ex-soldiers that were high-tech people that were afraid that the high-tech industry will be hurt. Ex-soldiers who were afraid that, first of all, the government maybe will send them to missions that they cannot fulfill. And in generally speaking, they say, we are soldiers, we cannot be soldiers in dictatorship. And the numbers grew and grew. The military was very important in the sense that thousands of Israeli reservists and you have to understand that the Israeli army is built very much on reservists, especially the Air Force. Thousands announced that they will not serve. This is really unheard of. The numbers of all those who refused to serve in the Israeli army since the occupation, 67 occupation of the Palestinian lands, is something in the hundreds, maybe in 56 years. And now in 1 month, we are talking about thousands. So really, it was immense. And what happened is that the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, Likud member, was really under heavy pressure from the military, from his companions, I would say, colleagues, to go against it, because there was a real feeling that the Israeli army will collapse, nothing less. People are talking about the Israeli army, or at least the Air Force, collapsing. So he issued a statement that he wants the reform to be postponed for a few weeks. Netanyahu, in a completely irrational move, fired him 2 days later, just a day before the law, the first of the laws of the reform, one concerning the committee to appoint judges, was supposed to pass. He fired him just a day before, and I would say in a span of 15 minutes, I'm not exaggerating, 15 minutes from the moment that it was announced that he is firing his Minister of Defense, there were hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the streets all over the country. Tel Aviv was blocked, the main highway belt, the belt highway of Tel Aviv, that is really the most busiest road in Israel at all, was blocked for something like 10 hours by tens of thousands of people building barricades, burning woods, really scenes that we have seen maybe in the West Bank. And that was like this all over the country, even in cities that are considered Likud, leaning for the Likud, like Beersheba, Netanya, and other cities that are considered very right-wing cities. So it was really a reaction that no one has ever seen in the history of Israel. And Netanyahu really had to bow down. And the next day, he announced that he is postponing the passing of the law, and there will start now a process of negotiation in order to reach an agreed upon reform.
And who are they supposedly negotiating with? I mean, I want to talk about this push for the Constitution, because that seems to have sort of grown over the past 3 or 4 weeks. But before we get there, who are they negotiating with? And it also feels like Netanyahu not only made a massive mistake in firing the defense minister because of the nature of the Israeli sort of psyche's relationship with the military. Because, it for, at least the first, 25 years or so of Israel's existence, that was like an existential relationship with the military.
Yes.
Talk about the right-wing coalition that he has built, because this coalition does not seem to be amenable to any type of negotiations. And I'm not saying that anybody on the, nominal center or left should negotiate, frankly, either, but they seem very much in transit, and that this is what we're here for. And if we don't get this, there's no point in it.
Yes, there is this feeling, there is this atmosphere in the right wing, in the Likud and the other parties of the coalition, right wing parties in the coalition, that we were elected in order to pass this reform. Punto basta, as they say in Italian, and that's it. I still. Now, and because of that, they refused to negotiate the whole of this 3 months, despite the growing protest. Now they are forced to negotiate. It is very difficult to see a compromise, but they negotiate first of all with the parties, the center-left parties, especially Yesh Atid of Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz, but the protesters, although it's a completely unofficial body and not unorganized, they supervise these politicians from above. It's not the other way around. It's not the politicians that affect the protesters, it's the other way around. So I think that the chances of a compromise are slim, especially, and I will, touch the point that you mentioned already, especially as the protest, especially in the last weeks, the new demand was not only to turn down this reform, but to go back to the history of Israel that refused to pass a constitution from its early days, from 48, because it was afraid from the idea of equality for Arabs and also, in a way, for women, because ultra-Orthodox were given extra rights. And so to pass, the calls came from the protesters themselves. Now it is adopted by Yair Lapid and by the president, Yitzhak Herzog, to pass or a constitution, or at least a basic right, equality, guaranteeing equality. This, I think, will be extremely hard for the right wing to accept, because it really contradicts everything that they believe in. They don't believe in equality. They certainly not for Palestinian, and also not for secular Jews, and not for women. So I don't see them accepting this demand. And the compromise, I think, will not be achieved. The question is, will after the efforts to reach a compromise will fail, will Netanyahu try to reenact the same reform that was proposed before and risk a much larger protest, or that he will back down and risk that his government will fall apart?
And the other question, though, it seems to me, is there momentum for this push for a constitution, right? I mean, Israel was given through a mandate that and sort of came out of a British system on some level. So the absence of the constitution had some sort of justification beyond the idea that equality also might be a slippery slope in this instance. And I'm quite convinced that the day a constitution, if it was ever to occur, would be passed in Israel, would not be a panacea. But I do think that there is an argument if I don't want to offer not just equality, even if I was to believe that, okay, equality, for the secular Jews and the women, I mean, we can haggle over that. but as long as we don't give equality for the Palestinians, like, I don't think you can quite do that. I think once you open up that door to a constitution and have a mechanism that sits apart from where the sort of like electoral political power has, I think it's a real threat to, the current system that Israel has, where it subjugates and ignores the existence and, at least as a citizenry of the majority of people that they control essentially in their government. So the real question is how close, how significantly has been that concept of having a constitution been adopted? Like, is there a new position of you're not going to get 100, 200, 300,000 people off the streets unless we get a constitution, because we're aware now of what could happen? Because, I mean, in all honesty, like, okay, even if Netanyahu backs down in a month, what's to say he's going to do in 3 months or 5 months or 6 months or 18 months or 2 years? Like, this is the trajectory the country is on. Is that apparent to at least a significant portion of people?
It's in this sense, I think we are in really a very dramatic and maybe historic moment in the history of Israel, maybe in the history of Zionism. Israel, from its start, and maybe Zionism, was based this way or another on the concept of some kind of Jewish supremacy. That was, even if it was not stated officially in law, that was the idea. It was in a way institutionalized in the nation-state law in 2018. But that's really part of the identity of the State of Israel. It is certainly the ideology of this government, of this coalition. That's, what cement them together is their belief that Jews have a rights for supremacy, that this state should be Jewish. And if it can be democratic, that's okay. But first of all, it has to be Jewish. And therefore, having a constitution or even a basic law of equality is something very dramatic that could change the character of Israel, not only of this government, but the character of Israel from 48 onwards. And therefore, it's a huge issue. What is really interesting here is that, yes, I feel, and it's very hard to say because it's everything, as I said, is very decentralized. There's no group there's no one person that you can go to and say, listen, we should go for that and convince him or her. It does not exist. It's completely decentralized. But I feel that the mood of these tens of thousands that really went to the streets, confronted the police, were ready to be arrested, get hurt, and maybe even get killed. I'm not exaggerating. People were ready to get killed, that have their life to pay in their life for this. The atmosphere, the mood is, yes, we want to set new laws, new rules for this state. It's not enough to go back to January 2023, before the reform was proposed. We have to really, restructure Israel in a more just and equal way. I feel this is the atmosphere. Now, whether this really forces that come from below will have enough force, enough stamina, enough endurance to push forward for such a dramatic move, I don't know. The stakes are extremely, extremely high, as I presented now. But yes, I see new awareness, even among, and this is really strange, even among these pilots who bombed in Gaza and are bombing now, or in Lebanon or in Syria, or who were supposed to bomb in Iran, saying no, we need equality is something we have to uh, 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 to reform this state on a more equal footing. Now,
there's an asterisk. There's an asterisk there that the asterisk being who we're talking about giving, who is the cohort that we're allowing for equality. But I think, you and I are probably, and I think we all agree that once you introduce the notion of a codified call for equality, and we've seen it in this country, right? I mean, it's taken a very long time, but we started with slaves, and we had this aspiration for equality. All men are created equal. It took a long time, but we're also in a different era, and the progression of these things, happens more rapidly.
I think words do have meaning. Yes, there was a lot of criticism
particularly when they're written in the Constitution and they have the power of law.
From the more radical left, and also from Palestinian citizens of Israel and in the West Bank, that when they are talking about democracy, these protesters, they're talking about democracy for Jews, and they're talking about equality for Jews, and there is something into it. It's not completely baseless, but I do think that words do have meaning. And once you say, democracy or rebellion, that's, the main slogan shouted in the streets, democracy. Once you say, what is important to me is democracy, what is the highest value for me is democracy and equality, then I think there is a chance that you will go further first of all, for equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And I'm confident, but I'm
I have my concerns.
An optimist without any reason that it will also refer to the Palestinian and the West Bank in the end.
But there is a concern to me that any kind of document in the short term under this current apartheid, right, would only further congeal the existing power dynamics, as opposed to a more revolutionary process in which, say, Palestinians have equal stake. The concern would be that, like, we see this in the United States, democracy, some of these equality, it's defined very differently by the right than the left defines it, right? And so my concern would be that this would be a way to put additional barriers on ending the occupation.
I think that adding additional barrier, I don't think it will happen. The barriers are so high today that equality and constitution will not add barriers. But you're right in saying that there is a real danger that it will not address these core issues, that it will not address the core inequality between Jews and Palestinians. There is this risk. But I think, first of all, I think, as I described before, the very notion of bringing in these ideas into the legal debate is very important. But it cannot, you are right, it cannot end there. It's not something to discuss procedures. No, we have to go much further to change the mentality of the Jewish majority in Israel, to have new thinking. It goes, I think it will have an expression in the law, in the constitution, in basic law. But the process is much, wider, and that will aim at changing the mentality, the way Jews think in Israel, and understand that they are not superior and have no privileges and should not enjoy any privileges not inside Israel, and not between the river and the sea. With the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip.
Has there ever been any type of popular movement that has called for a constitution in Israel's history? I mean, I know that there's been like intellectual movements, maybe within the context of like universities, and it was an interesting debate occasionally to have. But has there ever been any type of like popular movement at all for a constitution? And we should say that like it is so hard to imagine this government or anything reasonably facsimile setting up a constitutional convention. It's so hard to even imagine how that process would exist in the Israel as it's currently constructed. But it's part of but it's also sort of hard to imagine like where we are today versus 4 months ago.
There were some parties in the 90s, more centrist, by the way, more, I would say, bourgeois parties, representing the more bourgeoisie in Israel, more centrist, that wanted constitution, but that was mainly, private property, and secular. So, but they never, there was never a mass movement, hundreds of thousands people in the streets shouting "Constitution," shouting, the cry while they were taking over this road, this beltway around Tel Aviv. The main slogan was, if we don't have equality, we will topple the government. So this kind of thing, I don't remember, not in the size and not in the intensity and courage of these protesters that are ready really to fight, be arrested, get hurt, and maybe even worse. So no, I don't think there was anything like this. Now, the chances, as you say, the chances that the current Israeli government will accept the constitution are non-existent. The chance that it will start a process for a basic law of equality are very minimal but existent. There are other options, but if we will have something of it, it will be a huge win, a really huge win that will have consequences far beyond this crisis.
So what is next? What are you looking for next in terms of like trying to assess what's going to happen, or is it just one of those things where it's we're in uncharted territory, so there's really no even signposts?
I'm a journalist for more than 30 years, so I follow Israeli politics for many years. I've never experienced anything like it, where in the morning you don't know what will happen in the evening. And I'm not talking about war. There were wars, there were a military operation. I'm not talking about this. I'm talking really about, development inside the Israeli society, so swift, so huge that it's very hard to predict. And it's hard to predict the will, in this conversation, I was talking about what the protesters want, but there are 600,000 of them. So, anything to say, what do they want? Is ridiculous. How do I know what these 600,000 people want? But I think as I said before, I think that I would expect that a compromise will not be reached, and that the government will maybe try to pass some law. It will fail, I think. and the government will have to face a crisis, an internal crisis, and I think Netanyahu will go. We will have an election in the beginning of 2024, I think, or maybe even at the end of this year. This is my guess, but again, we could go for very dramatic and terrible scenarios. There was an agreement now, right after Netanyahu announced that he will postpone the laws. He had an agreement with Itamar Ben-Gvir, the head of the Kahanist party, to form some kind of a private militia that will be under his control as a minister. And we could have something like a fascist militia armed with official weapons, an official militia headed by the most extreme, racist, violent politician in the history of Israel, attacking Palestinian, Jewish protesters. We don't know. So I think Netanyahu now went into even more than a coalition, into really a he decided he's opting to go with Ben-Gvir, with the more fascist wings of the Israeli right, and almost abandoned his classical, traditional Likud party, which has elements that are more conservative, but not that radical. So it could be very, very dangerous.
Will you just, I mean, I'm old enough to remember Meir Kahan, who was, when I was a kid, just considered a really fringe lunatic. The idea that his party has achieved this level of power in the government and is now being given an okay to have, I don't know, what do you call, a roving paramilitary? It just, this is,
no, it's a militia. It will be a militia, an official militia, in the sense that it will be under the Ministry of Internal Security, but he will be responsible for this armed group.
Are there other militias run by other political parties? Has this ever happened before in the history of Israel?
It happened in the history of Germany, not
exactly.
So no, there was nothing like this, and yes, it's generally speaking, even if this militia will not, in the end, will not be formed, because there are some doubts if it will be really formed. The fact that Netanyahu opted to go with this Kahana, as you mentioned, was an American-born rabbi. He immigrated to Israel, formed a party that its manifesto was to drive out all the Arabs from Israel. That was its manifesto, and it was outlawed in the 90s by a right-wing government, by the way, by the Likud government. It was outlawed because it was too racist even for Israeli terms. And now his heirs are really in government and responsible for the police. So yes, and Netanyahu opted really to go with them and preferred them on his classical Likud party. Is not abandoning the Likud party, but the more moderate side, the more conservative side of the Likud party, he just abandoned them and go with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. So yes, it could be very, very dangerous.
All right.
Dangerous times.
Last question. Your just read a piece by Hagi Matar, who is a colleague of yours.
Yes.
And one thing that stuck out to me was, and I have seen clips where there's so many Israeli flags that are being held by these protesters, no Palestinian flags, and that there has been a concerted effort to not have Palestinian flags in these protests. I imagine by
I saw a video of someone ripping it out of someone's hand.
yes, and that there's and where are the what is happening within the communities of both Palestinian Israelis and occupied Palestinians? Like, how are they, like, what is, to the extent that there is, we can get a sense of how they as a cohort are reacting. There's a political organization there theoretically that could also, speak to this. Like, what is the official and sort of less official positions?
They feel, yes, what happened with the Israeli flag is very interesting. It's really, they really took over. The protests took over the Israeli flag, who belonged to the right wing, and just, took it to themselves. And, it's quite an intelligent move, I must say. I don't feel very comfortable with it, but it's very intelligent because, it disrupted, the whole system. At the same time, of course, it completely estranged the Palestinians, whether they are inside Israel or in the occupied territories, because, of course, the flag, it's the flags of the occupier. As for Palestinian flag, in the beginning, it's interesting because in the beginning, there were these attacks that you mentioned. Flags were being grabbed by other protesters. The atmosphere changed in the last 12 weeks. Vis-a-vis these Palestinian flags. I go every week to Tel Aviv in demonstration. There's what we call the block against the occupation. A few hundred, maybe thousand, more than 1,000 people every week, and we have Palestinian flags. And it's not a huge number, but a few dozens, and people got accustomed to them, and above all, got accustomed to this block against the occupation. They hear this as slogans saying there's no democracy with occupation, and democracy between the river and the sea, and and they take the signs and distribute them. So I feel I wouldn't say dramatic, but certainly a change in the way the mainstream protesters look at the block against the occupation. But certainly the Palestinians feel completely estranged from this. There were some Israeli Palestinian, who were on the stage in Haifa, in Beersheba, in other places, also in Tel Aviv. But it's a minority. Most of them feel that it's an internal Jewish issue. When and if we will start, and this is what I'm hoping, when and if we will start really talking about basic law equality, then I think Palestinian could feel, at least Palestinian citizens of Israel, could feel more, at home in such a struggle. It will be easier for them to identify with such a struggle. But now, with the predominance of military slogans, military presence, yes, they feel, and the flags, they feel that it's not their place.
Meron Rappaport, editor at Local Call, writer at 972 Magazine. Thank you so much again for keeping us updated. I imagine we will have an opportunity, hopefully, to check in with you again. It is fascinating what's going on there, and it does feel that we are sort of at a precipice that could go two very radically different ways.
Yes.
But it also does feel like the status quo is not holding, and so something is.
I would say, the bottom line. The status quo that Netanyahu was the master of in his 15 years in power is collapsing. Where we go from now, big question.
Meron Rappaport, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.